Hello and welcome to Bristol Data Stories, the podcast where we talk with people using data science in research. Brought to you by the Jean Golding Institute at the University of Bristol, I'm your host, Madlen Williams.
And I'm her co-host, Will Chapman. For this Black History Month podcast special, we're joined by our guest, Leighan Renaud. She is a lecturer at the University of Bristol whose research focuses on Anglophone Caribbean literature around themes such as gender, family, neo-coloniality, legacies of slavery and language. Leighan has recently been working with Research IT to develop some digital archiving ideas for folk stories in St Lucia, which we'll be finding out more about today.
Hello Leighan, welcome. It's lovely to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
To start with, Leighan, could you give us a bit more information about you and your work, in particular the digital archiving project, and maybe just give us some definitions and context? So, for example, what is a folk story and what's the motivation to archive them?
Sure. So my official title is Lecturer in Caribbean Literatures and Cultures. My research generally focuses on kind of hyper-contemporary literature. I'm very interested in what people are reading and writing right now. And so I guess in some ways this kind of folk research is taking that kind of very contemporary focus in a slightly different direction. So we started working quite recently on a project about folk cultures and folklore in the Eastern Caribbean. So we're looking at like the Lesser Antilles and some of the smaller islands in the region. And we're interested in folk stories and how folk stories move, why they're still told today, why they continue to circulate. And when I say a folk story, I mean a story, an oral story. So a story that's kind of told on porches, front porches, in playgrounds, on the roadside even. And they circulate locally. So they're these kind of vernacular literary traditions. And we started because we were interested in this one story that's told in St Lucia, which is the story of a figure called the Tibolom. The Tibolom is a Creole term that translates to little man. But what the Tibolom actually is not a little man. It's in fact this kind of malevolent demon that's conjured by various people to do their malevolent bidding. So it's this kind of menacing figure on the island, but pretty much everybody knows what a Tibolom is and has a story about the Tibolom. So I was interested, and so was my research team. We were interested in kind of finding out a little bit more about why this story continues to be told, the different ways that it is told on the island, the different people who are telling the stories. We were interested in like different generations of storytellers. And then I guess the overarching question was, how do you go about how do you go about archiving a folk story, right? Folk stories are almost these ephemeral things. They exist in the head. So they're, and then once the story is told, the story changes because as you're telling the story, people are responding to the story. So that ultimately informs the story as well, right? Not just the storyteller, but the people listening. So we wanted to know how you would go about archiving a folk story. If you should, in fact, archive a folk story, that's a question that we're still kind of grappling with. And what would it mean to archive that folk story? So we got some money initially from the Bristol Institute to do some fieldwork in St Lucia. We worked with some local researchers, some local videographers, and I was Adam Fuligin-Heron, who's an anthropologist at the University of Bristol. And we went to film 9 or 10 iterations of the Tibolom story. And we heard stories that were told by older women, cultural practitioners, people in their 20s. We even heard some stories from some school children as well, who had heard the stories from their grandmothers and were kind of telling us these stories. And all of these different stories, these stories of the Tibolom, they had their kind of similarities, right? But all of them had their own kind of like distinct flavor, which was really, really nice. So we were kind of thinking about, if we were to record these stories or to archive these stories for diasporic communities who no longer live on the islands and so aren't able to access the stories as they're told, when they're told, maybe one of the ways to do that would be to archive several different iterations of the story to try and capture like the living animated spirit. So that's where the research started. But as we were on the research trip and we were traveling up and down the island to record these stories and to talk to lots of different people, what we realized is that these stories kind of have their own geography, right? So the storyteller will bring us into the story and bring us into, I guess, like the story universe, right? And they'll tell us the story, but they'll also maybe tell us where certain things happened in the story, where they first heard the story, who their favorite storyteller was and where on the island they lived. And so actually this really kind of interesting geography of the island starts to emerge from these folk stories. So I applied for some seed corn funding from the Jean Golden Institute because I wanted to see if it would be possible to create a map, right? To create a folk map using these stories and to do it in such a way that kind of feels alive and allows whoever's looking at the map to sort of like move with the story. So that's what I've been working with Research IT on.
Wonderful. Really fascinating. So just to make sure I've understood correctly, as you were listening to these stories, not only were you hearing stories from different generations and in different iterations, but you were also finding that these places and geographies were emerging. So these folk stories are kind of creating a map unto themselves that's maybe different from a Google map or the kind of conventional map that you're going to see of a place. So it's a different way of kind of understanding a place and a history through these stories. Is that right? And the kind of the digital archiving methodology or process gives opportunity for archiving, but without like holding something in static or is that correct? Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. Folk stories are these really important knowledge systems, right? You tell a story for entertainment purposes, but they're usually moralistic, right? So there's some kind of moral at the end of it. They want you to learn something. Quite often, folk stories would be told to children as like a form of instruction. So there's something about them that feels like this kind of decolonial knowledge system. And as we kind of were on the island and kind of thinking through what these folk stories were doing, we realized, or we kind of hypothesized, that there would be a way to map the island from the ground up, if you like, right? So start with local knowledge, folk stories, and create some kind of map from there, rather than create a map that's based on a very long colonial history of the island, right? You've got all of these different name places. Lots of places in St Lucia, for instance, are named after like great admirals from Britain. Like there's this place called Rodney Bay, and locals have been petitioning for ages to get the name changed because actually he was not a good person and was quite dangerous to the island, right? So what the idea of this folk map is that you can subvert that process of mapping, start with the people and map the island from there out, rather than start with this kind of big colonial legacy and map from above, if that makes sense. So we were interested in thinking about like the decolonial potential of a map like that. And then, yeah, you're absolutely right. We also were interested, because we were thinking about these stories as iterative and wanting to capture the fact that there are so many iterations of them. We wanted to think about archiving in a way that kind of captures the fluidity and the aliveness of these stories. And, you know, it's something that we're still thinking about, but one of the ways to start thinking about them as these living, very alive, mobile, fluid things is to capture lots and lots of iterations, to give them all equal space in the archive that gets created.
So that's really cool. Yeah. You started off with recordings of people talking to them, and, you know, I think I'm interested in sort of the process you went to from turning that very sort of interpersonal, qualitative thing into sort of things you could place into a map or make a map out of. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I would like to give all credit to Research IT, who I came to with a vision, and they were just amazing in kind of thinking with me about how we might do it. In terms of how we turned the videos into data that could then be used to create this map, I was asked to transcribe the stories to kind of pick out the different places that were mentioned in the stories, different locations, and then to see how best I could find them on a map, so that Research IT could then go in and do their magic and turn that into this kind of very fluid mobile map that they created for us.
Nice. So, and were there sort of any challenges that you didn't anticipate in this process that you came up against? You know, because it is a very different way of, like, you know, if you're normally going to make a map, in these days you'll take a picture from very high up, and then sort of do some tracing, whereas this is definitely not that. This is working from what people experience and talk about.
You're right. It's not like a drone approach to mapping, right? It's very much kind of working with people outwards, which was really beautiful. But it does come with its challenges. So in St Lucia, the official language is English, but locally there is a Creole that's spoken amongst lots of people, and that's a French-based dialect, because St Lucia, like much of the English-speaking Caribbean, kind of changed hands between English and French colonial rule several times. So on quite a few of the Eastern Caribbean islands, actually, they kind of locally speak this Creole language. What that means, though, is that there will be certain name places that storytellers are telling you, and they'll give you local names, which are Creole names, which don't always translate to the name that is on the official map, right? And so sometimes, as I was kind of working through the transcripts and trying to make sure that we were mapping correctly and making sure we were getting all of the place names right, it would mean having to speak to several people from St Lucia, because someone might, for instance, mention a dayglow. And a dayglow is a Creole term that translates to two waters. So day, glow, water. And when people are talking about a dayglow, they're talking about a place where the river meets the sea. So like an estuary. But people in St Lucia understand dayglows as having lots of power, like spiritual, magical power, right? And there are several in St Lucia, several dayglows. And then there's also a town called Dayglow in St Lucia as well. So sometimes it meant having to go back to the storyteller themselves and just be like, hello, could you just tell me which dayglow are you talking about? Like in what kind of general location? Are you talking about the one in the south, in the north? You're not talking about the town, are you? So just like lots of like fact checking had to go in.
Did they always have an answer for you, or were they?
Yeah,
okay.
They did.
So,
they knew what they were talking about. Yeah. So the problem was me. I was always the problem. So that was one of the challenges. And then the other challenge, I guess, because you're working in a place that has this kind of local language, a language which has only relatively recently been formalized and standardized. And only recently has St Lucia decided to start, formally teaching Creole in schools. So because of that, because of its kind of recent history of standardization, the spellings can differ quite greatly, right? And so then that's the other question. How do you write, as you're kind of making this transcript, what's the right way to write a phrase like dayglow, right? As far as I can see, there are like two different spellings that are accepted for the word glow, water. And so just thinking kind of ethically about what to do with, little moments like that are challenges that I didn't foresee, because I wasn't thinking about transcription and I wasn't thinking about the data until we got to this point of the project.
Nice.
Leighan, this seems to broach into the field of work known as the digital humanities. would you call this a digital humanities project? And if so, can you tell us your understanding of digital humanities? Because there's a lot of different understandings out there. It's a pretty contentious place at the moment, and people are, really excited by the opportunity to try to bring data science into the humanities and bring humanities into more of the STEM areas, but are finding significant challenges to do so. One of those challenges being to define what it is. So what is your understanding of digital humanities in the context of this project?
Sure. I'm going to give a very short definition of digital humanities because I don't want to get dragged into
I don't blame you.
How I understand digital humanities is that it's kind of concerned with the intersection between the humanities and digital technology, right? So it's thinking about how to approach the study of humanities using digital methods, digital technology, digital practices, right? And a lot of digital humanities work, a lot of what digital humanities does is think about creating digital resources like databases, like maps, like archives. So this project, I think, squarely sits within the digital humanities arena. We're kind of conceiving of it as a multidisciplinary project, right? So it's, I'm a literary scholar by training. We're thinking about these folk stories as embodied literary artifacts, as literary texts. There's also this kind of historical element as we were kind of thinking about, what Tibolom is and where that might have come from. We're thinking about that. But it's also anthropological and ethnographic, and being able to kind of talk to people and meet people in environments that they're comfortable with and just sit and talk to them as well is really rich. And so we're trying to bring all of that into a database with into the digital. So I would say digital humanities for sure.
An interesting, or I think a thing to note is that you're saying you're approaching as a multidisciplinary project rather than an interdisciplinary project, I guess, because it seems that you've got this knowledge and this solid kind of training and background as a literary scholar, and then working with Research IT, who have got a lot more knowledge on the data and the data science side of things. And I know there's a push for kind of people to try to be both and to try to upskill into either or, which can definitely be challenging. But did you find any challenges in communicating your vision with Research IT, or was that a fairly straightforward process? What was the communication like?
It was actually fairly straightforward. I had several conversations with Research IT before we got this funding, just about visions for this project. And when we got the funding, we again had a really long chat about what we imagined for the map. But because I'm not a data scientist and I'm quite bad with computers in general, I was kind of like, just show me anything, right? Like, this is what we think we want to create. I don't know if we can create it, but just like, let's just give it a go, right? And Research IT were amazing. They were just like, yes, let's go. And not only were they, conscientious in thinking about, okay, well, technically, how would you create a map like this? But they also, I think, straight off the bat, understood the decolonial vision behind this map, right? The fact that this was almost like a writing back to or writing back against colonial mapping, right? Wanting to do something different. And so they thought really hard even about things like the color scheme for the website, making sure that the words of the storytellers were properly transcripted, making sure that they had the right locations for places, and just double checking back with me to make sure that everything seemed right to me. They were really, really conscientious about the project, and it seems like they just understood what we wanted. So it actually was like, it's been a really lovely process, to be fair. And I hope we get to continue working with them.
Yeah, I think one thing I found sort of looking at the prototype website, which we can link to in the show notes for this episode, is that it's kind of like, it feels at the same time as a research tool and an outreach tool, and also sort of this sort of living archive that you've mentioned already. And do you feel like it sort of does fill all these different roles? And how do you see it sort of evolving in the future? And what's your sort of wish list of what it could be and what it could do?
Yeah, sure. So we're currently working on a AHRC grant to extend the project. So we want to think about folk stories that are told on 3 different islands in the Eastern Caribbean, so Grenada, St Lucia and Dominica, and think about mapping several different kinds of stories as well. So we obviously looked at the Tibolom here, but we're interested in thinking about like mermaids and water dwellers, and that's because I have brought this long-standing obsession with mermaids, and so like, we're going to do that, right?
Nice objective reasoning there.
Yeah, exactly. I like mermaids, so we're just going to look at that, right? But also mermaid stories I know circulate in that region, right? So it fills me with happiness, but also it makes sense, right? So we're working on this grant to take that project much bigger. And we want to work again with Research IT to create a really interactive kind of like web map archive using the footage that we collect from that research. So in an ideal world, if we get that funding, or even if we don't get that funding, if we get some other funding, because this project will continue, the folk map will extend just across the region, right? One of the really beautiful things when we were doing the Tibolom research is that some of the stories, the geographies that they're exposing are very kind of local geographies. So they might stay in like a certain town in St Lucia, but move across different places in the town, the church, the day glow, Granny's house up there, whatever, right? But with some of these stories, the geography extends far beyond the island. It moves to different places in the Caribbean. At other points, it moves to West Africa, right? And so what we're hoping is that we are able to collect a much bigger archive, which showcases a much greater network of connection between these stories, between these islands, but like also much further out as well. And so I'm hoping that actually this kind of archiving has like a really like beautiful potential to demonstrate all kinds of, beautiful human geographies, interconnections, huge connected folk maps, all of that.
That's really awesome, yeah.
So as much as maybe this question isn't so necessary to ask in terms of the research, but I'd love to hear more about Tibolom. I'd love to hear more about people's stories and what they said and some of your findings. So, yeah, can you give us a bit of information about that?
You want some Tibolom?
I want some Tibolom, yes, please.
I should say that when we got to St Lucia and we started to ask people about this story, there was actually more hesitancy to tell it than I anticipated. Because to people in St Lucia, Tibolom is not just a story, it's real, right? So a lot of the stories that we got were based on how you go about conjuring a Tibolom. And the kind of specific details vary depending on the storyteller. And I don't know how much I should say. I'll tell you a little bit. I don't want to give you the specifics because like you should not try to conjure one yourself. So I'm not gonna.
I'm definitely no listener. Any listeners, please do not try to conjure a Tibolom. Yeah. We don't know who's listening, so don't give away too much.
No, I'm not going to give away too much. But I mean, and also the accounts for how you create one, they do differ slightly depending on person. So you have to take an egg. In some cases, it's a chicken egg. I should just say, not just like a goose egg or whatever, chicken egg. In some cases, you need to take the maiden egg of a chicken. How do you say that? So the first ever egg that a chicken
lays.
Yeah.
It's called the maiden egg.
I think so. I don't know.
It is.
We'll roll with it.
Yeah,
let's go for it.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Sounds like I know what I'm talking about. And you have to take it to sea when like the sun is setting. and then you say some words to it, and then you leave it for 3 days, and then you hatch it basically at that point. Or no, you don't hatch it. After 3 days, after you've said these particular words to it at the sea at a particular time, in 3 days, the Tibolom kind of is conjured from there. And the idea of the Tibolom is that it's this kind of, this in-between creature. So it's both of the human world, but also of the spiritual world. So people will kind of conjure it to do malevolent things. It can, transport itself, shapeshift, and all of the rest of it. And the problem with the Tibolom is that it's very difficult to get rid of. So after a while, you think that you're its master, but after a while, the tables always kind of turn, right? And actually, the Tibolom ends up controlling you. And because you are part of the reason why it's on this plane at all, it's going to be feeding off your energy, right? So even though you think that you're sending out to do your malevolent bidding, actually, it's kind of sucking the energy out of you. Wow. Right? There were some really interesting things that came up when we were kind of dissecting the story. And we were thinking about it as this kind of like aberrant, almost like an aberrant like pregnancy situation, right? Because you say these words to it and then you've got to hold it. That's what I didn't say. You've got to hold it underneath your armpit for like 3 days or something like that, right?
Like an incubation process.
Exactly.
Oh,
so
okay.
it's kind of like this like gross anti-womb, if you like, right? And there's something really interesting about like thinking about the parallels between the kind of Tibolom creation story and like gestation, right? And the sweat acts as almost like this amniotic fluid or something like that. There are some really interesting ways that you can read it.
Some interesting parallels.
Some really interesting parallels. So I've been really enjoying just kind of like, with my literary scholar hat on, just thinking about all of the ways that I can dissect some of this really interesting, like anti-maternal language around it. There's also some really interesting connections between this story and like French Catholicism, for instance. Even just thinking about like that 3-day period, right? I'm just thinking about, Jesus on the third day, et cetera, et cetera. In some of the tellings of the story, the egg has to be laid on Good Friday, right? Which is really interesting. And then there are some other versions of the story which explain the Tibolom as the soul of like an unborn child or something like that, right?
Wow.
So there's some really interesting ways that you can read the story, and really interesting ways that people on the island kind of understand the story. And some of them will connect the story back to kind of pre-colonial West African griot traditions and pre-colonial folk figures from Africa. And other storytellers are connecting it directly to like Catholicism, right? And so it's been really interesting, just like as somebody who's interested in folklore generally, thinking about where this story originates,
And is there reference to it in... because you're saying it's an oral tradition that's kind of kept alive via storytelling. Are there any kind of colonial archives of it? What's the earliest mention of Tibolom?
We're still looking, actually. We are working with a community historian from St Lucia called Fiona Compton, who runs a really big platform called Know Caribbean. And she's still looking. And so we've seen some instances of it being mentioned in like newspapers from like the mid to early mid 20th century. But she's still kind of trying to look back through the archives to see if there are any instances of this story being kind of like captured within the colonial archive. And it's something that we want to think about, right? As we're thinking about how to archive its current iterations, we also want to think about how it has been archived in like a static form, right? In a standard colonial archive. But that work is still going on. I don't have an answer.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I guess another thing to consider as well, if you're finding references to Tibolom in colonial archives, if Tibolom existed prior to colonialism, then how are the colonial archives painting the picture of Tibolom, and how are they setting a definition in stone? Was Tubolum a character previously that maybe had some very different traits, I think there's been various examples of colonialists taking local mythological figures and demonizing them, literally demonizing them, that has stuck because of archiving processes.
Yeah.
So the question that you're asking, should this even be archived? And if so, how can it be done in a way that's fluid? I can see a really valuable one just from this kind of bit of information. Brilliant.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Are you freaked out now?
Huh?
Are you freaked out?
A little bit.
I got some shivers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
And
got
people
a bit of
like,
shivers.
honestly, they were like, oh, can I tell you a story about some other folk creature? Like, and when I asked like several storytellers, several of the older storytellers, they were like, I said, do we think that this is real, or do you think it's a story? I said, no, it's real, And then they'd tell you the story about how it was created, and then someone would say, well, I know that man had a bolom in his shop, right? And so people have like actual experiences, like encountering them, or they know someone who had one, or they know someone who knows someone who had one. But there was this real kind of hesitance to want to tell that particular story because people are genuinely afraid of the Tibolom in a way that they're not necessarily afraid of other folk characters who exist on the island, which was really interesting.
Is that because this is just like the worst one? Because when you were talking earlier, it felt more like here's a sort of a moralistic parable about don't seek revenge, or it'll just bounce back in your face and you'll have a terrible time. But that feels like that's my reading of what you were saying, rather than how these people are experiencing it.
Yeah, I think in many cases the Tibolom story does warn against like greed, and this idea of wanting and wanting and wanting so much that you're willing to conjure this kind of mythical creature, which then ends up just taking and taking and taking and taking, right? So I think that's maybe part of the reason why it's so scary. But I also wonder if there's something else to say about the way that Catholicism has found itself kind of entangled in that story, right? And so now it's no longer just a story that exists on the island. It's a story that also exists in relationship to the kind of most heavily practiced religion on the island, right? St Lucia is a relatively conservative Christian country, know? And so I wonder what role Christianity plays in the way that people receive that story and then go and tell that story as well. But these are all things that I'm still kind of thinking through. It's a really rich archive. It's a small archive, but it's really rich. There's some real gems in there, So I'm enjoying this kind of slow process of going through and thinking with what these people are saying.
Yeah, and has the map given you any sort of slightly different perspective on how these things come together?
I think the map has, I guess, made me appreciate just how mobile the stories are, right? And how mobile the Caribbean is, The fact that these stories can move from, a very specific point on the island, in a flash go to a completely different island. It makes me kind of curious about the way that these stories travel, the way that these characters travel, the way that these characters are understood on different islands, but also, the possibility that these characters in some iteration exist in just a completely different region of the world, right? It makes me really excited for that possibility. So the map, I think, has just opened up like a lot of excitement and a lot of potential for where we could go, which is great.
Yeah.
Leighan, you're clearly really excited about this topic. And I can see there's scope for so much more. I am curious about your trajectory to get to this point. In this podcast, we generally ask people about their kind of career through research and their personal motivations to pursue what they're pursuing. And yeah, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that, about yourself.
Sure. So, literary scholar by training. My PhD was looking at 21st century Caribbean fiction and representations of motherhood and mothering and mother-centered communities. which in many ways is not worlds away from this research, because actually what you find is a lot of people saying that their grandmothers introduced them to these folk stories, right? There's a way that Caribbean communities are mother-centered in nature. And so a lot of the vernacular kind of knowledge that travels around these islands, for many people, start with the mother or the grandmother, right? So that's kind of where I started, interested in thinking about family and the way that families are represented. More broadly interested in thinking about practices of neo-archiving and what, in the context of the Caribbean, where, you know, relationships to history with a capital H, official histories, the archive with a capital A, they're so fractured, right? What then do you do with that archive? And are there other ways of accessing, you know, our history, lowercase h, right? The way that I came to this project actually is because my partner is from St Lucia, and he was telling me the story of the Tibolom with like a couple of his friends. And then we just kind of got to thinking about, well, why doesn't a film exist about this? You know, that would make a great film, right? Great scary movie. Like, why doesn't it exist now? Why aren't these stories circulating better than they are? Especially when, you know, there are such huge diasporic communities living in the UK, in America, and far beyond, right? They would love to have this kind of access to this rich folk heritage. So, you know, this project kind of came from that bit of thinking. And I also have a son, a 4-year-old son, who has been very fortunate to travel to the Caribbean with us. He came on this research project actually, and it was really funny because as we're like recording these like kind of scary stories about these tiny child-sized malevolent Tiboloms, you just hear my son in the background like, ah! And so on the recording it's kind of like, oh, is that a Tibolom or is that just a child? Or you'll just see like his shadow like darting past. It's quite funny actually. But making sure that he has access to these like integral parts of his cultural heritage is really important, right? And so part of this work is about archiving for future generations, including him, and making sure he has access to such a rich culture, such a rich knowledge base as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, there's a lot of work at the moment, isn't there, with archiving histories, lowercase histories, that's not the capital H histories. And so much of culture and cultural history and local knowledge has been either lost or kind of really smushed down. And this work feels really akin to trying to revive that and bring life into it and expand it. And that feels so important to bring in alternative types of knowledges altogether, rather than the dominant kind of colonialist knowledge that has pervaded for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said before, folk stories, folk cultures, these are forms of knowledge creation, they're forms of knowledge circulation, right? And they're grassroots forms of knowledge circulation. I just think, you know, with all of the conversations we in the academy have about decolonizing education and, you know, all of the rest of that, it's so important to start thinking about how to preserve those forms of knowledge in an increasingly kind of globalized way. These are local forms of knowledge. These are democratic forms of knowledge as well, which is really exciting. And, you know, the work of preserving them, I think, is really important.
And globally accessible.
Yes.
Yeah,
we want global accessibility for sure. Yeah.
Leighan, it's been great having you on the show today.
Thank you.
And really great to have someone who's working in digital humanities in such a kind of interesting perspective or approach. Before you go, we'd like to ask, what is your top tip for anyone looking to get into your field?
It's a hard question to answer because I don't know how I got into my field. I think curiosity, right? Just asking the questions and not being afraid if you don't find an answer. You know, I started a PhD because I had some questions that I was just curious. I was reading and I was curious, and I somehow ended up here, right? So I think just be curious and don't be afraid to ask very niche questions about that very niche thing that you're very, very interested in, that you think no one else will be interested in, but actually they will be interested in. That would be my tip.
Good tip. Solid bit of advice, I reckon. And if any of our listeners want to find out more about your research or your work, where should they look?
Feel free to check out my research profile on the University of Bristol website. The prototype map is available for people to look at if they're interested. We have Telling Tales, that's the name of the project, I should have said, the big project, an Instagram page, and you can watch some of the recordings of some of our storytellers there. So it's just at Telling Tales Caribbean. And we'll be doing a little bit more work in Grenada at the end of this year. So there'll be some more content. And yeah, that's where to find us.
Lovely. I will definitely check for that work that's upcoming at the end of the year. That sounds really exciting. And we'll share links to all of those in the description for anyone that would like to follow up and to find out more. And finally, thank you, Leighan, for telling us your data story.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. If you have any ideas for guests you'd like to hear from or topics we should discuss, we'd love to hear from you. You'll find contact details and the link to join our newsletter in the description.
Your hosts today were Madlen Williams and Will Chapman. Your producer was Kerry Turksey, and Bristol Data Stories was brought to you by the Jean Golding Institute at the University of Bristol.